So welcome everybody to the last talk of the day. Thank you all for sticking through it, paying attention. Last but not least, health and safety issues for the fossil preparator. They apply to the lab, to the field, everyday life, and I use this lovely picture of a field site in Montana as an example that even the most halcyon looking of situations can have dangers hiding in unexpected places. There were no snakes there. So let's go through the text of the competency itself. There are some pretty important parts to parse out from this. Number one being that, and the full text is actually in your booklets, that training is required. Nobody's born knowing all of these things. So training is a really important component of this competency. And that training should be sought out and renewed as we continue to develop new techniques and start using new materials associated with them. Also, you have to be able to do some research concerning safety data sheets for the materials that you're using and the techniques that incorporate them. And you are responsible for your own safety and for the safety of others and visitors that are working in your lab as well. Also, you have to have basic knowledge of emergency response and first aid and keep those up to date as your institutional policies change and policies for the training agencies change as well for first aid. Who is responsible for health and safety in your working environment? Ultimately, it's you, but what your role is in your institution gives you an additional list of roles and responsibilities. If you're a professional or a supervisor in your institution, you should be literate and seeking out training on health and safety topics and keeping records of the training that you have received. You should be the point of contact in emergency situations. You provide and update information such as those material safety data sheets. You ensure proper labeling and storage of the materials in your lab. You keep stock of appropriate PPE and safety supplies. You maintain and monitor the equipment that's in your lab. You seek out and update first aid CPR training. And you're a leader by example and an enforcer of the rules. If you're in an academic environment or in a museum, you may be working with people that don't know to or don't want to ask questions or request help regarding their health and safety. If you're a hobbyist or you're working in a smaller facility, you may often be working alone. And it's really, you need to be personally disciplined about safety because there's not going to be anybody tapping on your shoulder to remind you. If you're a supervisee, a student, or a volunteer, etc., you also need to have literacy and training when it comes to health and safety topics and keep records of such. You should be aware of your personal limits as you're working. Advocate for your own safety and ask questions. The why, as we've heard earlier today, is very important. You have to be personally observant, of course, and adherent to the safety policy, and also have first aid and CPR training. If you are a policy maker at your institution, you should have an awareness of your institution's legal responsibility to protect your workers and any visitors that are in your facilities. You should have a knowledge of materials and practices used in fossil preparation. You have to ensure compliance with things like OSHA regulations and also do a review of higher level safety policies, and this includes things like drills for emergency procedures, building code checks, and checking the lab safety for compliance. And you should also have first aid and CPR training because honestly everybody should. So I wanted to go through the core competencies today, kind of cycle back through as a way to reinforce what everybody's heard today, and take a look at health and safety as it pertains uniquely to each competency. So the first is, of course, critical thinking. Planning is key to prevention. When we talk about plans, I want to talk about your lab safety plan. I'll go into this in depth a little bit more later, but just to plant the seed, this plan should be used as a training material for all of your lab workers. And so if you don't have one, you're missing a huge part of your critical thinking when it comes to health and safety right there. Your lab safety plan has to be reviewed and approved by your institution to make sure that it's compliant with higher level regulations, and it must be compliant. Critical thinking is part of every task, and because health and safety is such an important part of your lab and how your lab functions, that plays into it as well. You have to think and walk through all steps of a task prior to performing it. And that includes asking yourself, do you have all the supplies and PPE that you need readily accessible? If you're working in an environment where you could start a fire, do you have a fire extinguisher there? Do you have emergency response equipment, like a walkie-talkie or a cell phone to call for help if you need it? And do you have the proper space to perform the task and proper help? You should communicate, especially if you're working with multiple people and performing a task. Make sure that everybody knows what all the steps are going to be from start to finish before you begin that task. And make sure that all of your participants are aware of any safety concerns that could come up during the performing of that task. This picture is an excellent example. It took 4 of us and a mechanical lift to wrangle this plastic but still very heavy T-Rex pelvis into place. If we weren't communicating with one another about where sockets had to align and whether or not screws and bolts were going into place, one of us could have had their hand slip, could have dropped something, it could have been a really bad scene. Fortunately, this all went off without a hitch. Next competency, aptitude for fossils as materials. I'm going to talk about lifting and handling a little bit here. We know that fossils are heavy and brittle, but you are light and ductile, comparatively. And best practices for specimen handling actually work both to prevent specimen breakage and personal injury, which are both good things. So when it comes to protecting yourself when you're doing lifting and carrying, gloves, people have differing preferences when it comes to gloves because they can protect your hands from things like scrapes. They're not going to prevent crushing injuries, and they can actually interfere with your grip on an object. So whether or not you use them and what kind of gloves you use, that's really personal preference. I would advocate a lot for practicing, doing a lot of lifts, especially team lifts, to try and figure out do you want to use gloves, do you not want to use gloves, work that out ahead of time if you can. Protective shoes are no question though. Definitely wear shoes with steel toes, ally toes that are going to protect your toes. Don't wear open-toed shoes in a laboratory environment. Everybody kind of knows the safe lifting basics. You lift with your knees, not with your back. You try and keep this weight centered close to your body, which can be difficult if you're working with a team. People may want to pull a jacket or a box closer to them and pull it farther away from you, which puts you at risk. That's why communication is key. And avoid twisting at the torso while you're carrying. When you're doing team lifts, again, plan actions and discuss them in advance. Communicate during the move, as I mentioned, and have a spotter that's standing at a distance that can flag trouble spots for you, like, oh, nope, there's an extension cord, you might want to watch out for the trip hazard, or you have 10 steps backwards until you hit the stairs. Very important to know. If you're using heavy equipment, which can be very helpful, even machines have their limits, and so it's important to have make sure that the weight of whatever object you're lifting has been properly estimated, and that it's properly balanced. You can use cargo nets and slings and things like that. It's very helpful. And if you don't have a trained operator, that's an additional risk factor that you're introducing if you rent a forklift but you have no idea how to use it. Make sure that you've got the brains to go behind the wheel. And if you have bracing structures or slope limitations on your equipment, make sure that you use them and observe those limits. For general handling, there's also some additional risks I wanted to talk about here, which mostly surface contaminants for specimens. They can have whitening powders on them, which may or may not be toxic. There are acids and salts that can effloresce to the surface of a specimen, sprays for chemical treatments, things like that, and pollutants into the dust that are on the specimen. So definitely wash your hands before you eat something. Next competency is aptitude for fossils as materials. Oh, sorry, we just went through that. A couple of pictures to go through here. One is just an example of us using some mechanical assistance for lifting and carrying objects. Instead of us getting up on those ladders, it would have been a little bit risky, so the mechanical lift comes in handy instead. When doing a team lift, it's nice to have a designated landing spot as indicated by this arrow and a clear movement path. And always make sure your triceratops is properly balanced before it's being lifted. Next competency, actually I've got 2 of them here. Aptitude for fossils is both biological and geological data. For biological data, we know that specimens, that bones themselves can be very complex objects. They can have pneumatic spaces in them, unseen weak spots, and knowing the anatomy of what you're picking up and handling can help you to determine where the strongest points are for lifting and carrying. It's useful both in the lab and in the field. And as geological data is concerned, there are specimens that have built-in hazards, such as radioactive mineral concentrations, which can cause a buildup of radon. They can have a high concentration of asbestos-form or silicate minerals in them, and this can impact both your prep plans and also your collection storage and your building systems that are associated with housing these collections. I know a lot of us in prep also work As sort of collections organizers, we're certainly in collections handling specimens all the time, so it's important to be aware of that. So a couple of examples, these are 3 lovely horses that we have from Hagerman National Monument that were previously on exhibit at the Smithsonian, and in collections where they're held in sealed cases, there is a buildup of radon in those cases. Because these 3 horses were exhibited in a space with a lot of ventilation, radon was not a concern for the public who was viewing these specimens. But it would be a concern in storage. And these caution signs are present on every door into our collection storage facility, just to make sure that people are aware when they're going in that they may be facing physical and chemical hazards in collections. Next step up is participation in science. It's really important for us to communicate best practices in health and safety and work with one another to develop these best practices. We are the end users of safety policies, which are not always developed by us. So we need to be talking up the chain and making sure that these policies can be revised to suit our needs. Experience, as we know, can be unique to an individual, and we often use tools and materials in ways that are completely unforeseen by the manufacturers of those products or even people in other professions who use the same tools and materials. Collaboration with safety professionals, such as industrial hygienists, can turn what would be colloquial knowledge for us into published research, and that helps get the word out about our safety concerns into other fields, which is very handy. When it comes to spreading the word, I just have a small sample here of talks that have been given in the past at collection symposiums in the past and others as well. There's way too many to list here, which is a good thing. And I'm happy to say that there will be some up and coming in the next coming days. So that's great. I think that especially talks and symposia are a terrific way to directly communicate with one another about health and safety concerns and how we can work together to address them. So I hope to see many more in the future. I'm skipping around here a little. Next competencies are number 6 and number 12, conservation and specimen use ethics. Conservation principles and ethics dovetail actually quite nicely with health and safety goals. It discourages the use of highly toxic substances if possible, like toluene and benzene. And it also encourages thorough testing of materials, which discovers not only their potential adverse effects on specimens, but their potential adverse effects on us. If it hurts the fossil, it's probably going to hurt us too. As far as ethical use of specimens goes, we recognize that we're responsible for the future of our specimens or objects as we're dealing with them, but we're also responsible in the actions that we take with those specimens. We're responsible for the health and safety of future users of those specimens. So our prep activities will directly inform any potential health and safety hazards concerned with these specimens in the future, and preventing damage, breakage, making sure they're in good housings minimizes health and safety risk to human caretakers. If we're using hazardous specimens, those should be labeled clearly on the outsides of their cases so people are aware of what's going on with these specimens before they even go to access them. And we should be monitoring those cases in storage environments for exposure risks. If we're using hazardous materials, when it comes to it, we do no harm when we're choosing new materials to use. And when it comes to older specimens that may have things like lead paint on them or asbestos and filler materials, we want to label those and work to mitigate and encapsulate those hazards where we can. A good example here is this lovely diprotodon skull, which was also previously on exhibit at NMNH. It had some sculptural filler to fill in some missing bits and pieces that had asbestos mixed in with the plaster. And the specimen was tested to make sure that it didn't have asbestos. It did. It was labeled appropriately and handled appropriately when deinstalled from exhibit. Until then, because the asbestos was encapsulated, it was perfectly safe for exhibition. Next competency is documentation and record keeping. This is a big one because we get into, again, lab safety plan, right to know, and there's a lot of legal responsibilities that go along with documentation. Basically, it boils down into information plus access to that information plus training equals safety. I'm going to talk again about a lab safety plan. These can be structured in a lot of different ways, and so I can't get into specifics of boilerplate what you should have in your plan, but every lab safety plan should describe all of the processes and materials that are used in your lab. It should outline risks and how to mitigate them, and it should have responses to specific emergency for your building, like fire evacuation, things like that. Your plan should be reviewed and updated on a regular basis. For us at the Smithsonian, it happens once a year. It should be used to train all new lab personnel. It's the heart of your training documentation. And if it's ever renewed or altered, all users have to be retrained on those changes to the plan. And don't hide it. Your plan should be available openly for reference by all of your workers at any time, and you should share copies with your building staff and your institutional management as well. So I said there's no boilerplate really for a lab safety plan, but there are a few standards that really kind of vary by institution and by country. Talk to your institutional higher-ups, especially your legal folks, to make sure that you've got in your lab safety plan what needs to be there. And certainly feel free to request lab safety plans from other facilities, institutions to see what they're doing if you're missing something that they should have. And I should mention that I've got copies of the Smithsonian's lab safety plan with me if anybody would like to see them. Come visit me at my poster this afternoon. OSHA produces a fact sheet that's really handy, so I wanted to highlight it here. It's a chemical hygiene plan that's mandatory for all facilities that classify themselves as labs. So that's an excellent place to start, particularly if you're concerned about your chemical storage. But ultimately, your plan is unique to your lab, and it's based on the processes and equipment that you have in it. And just make sure your plan is approved by your facility for legal reasons. That's really important. So I wanted to talk about other documentation and records. That includes a lot of lab user guides and signage, sort of helpful how-tos that you can keep posted around the lab. And if you have manuals or usage guides that go along with your equipment, make sure that they stay accessible with your equipment, not tucked away in a drawer somewhere where nobody knows where they are. You should also have copies of any legal waivers or incident reporting forms at the ready, and records of any training history that you and your lab staff have undertaken. And also you should have maintenance records and inventories of your equipment, testing results for vibration for your hand tools, and how effective your air evacuation and filtration systems are, and also any building tests for mold and asbestos to make sure your facility itself is A-OK, and inventories of your PPE, your first aid kits, things like that, and your chemical amounts and what types you have. Safety records should also be part of your prep records. We've heard a lot today about how prep records, we really need to make sure that we're writing down all pertinent information, and that includes what steps that you've taken in your prep processes to ensure your health and safety. It's really important for future reference, and it's also really important for legal reasons. If you don't record that you were using PPE during a particular technique and you happen to get hurt, somebody could say, oh, you weren't following the proper health and safety tips, your injury is your fault. But if you write that stuff down, you're covered. Also wanted to talk about hazard communication standards, right to know, which is where our MSDS, which are now called SDS, safety data sheets, that's where they come in. We heard a little bit about safety data sheets before, so I'm not going to go into detail again, but they're really handy because they have all of the health and safety info you need right there on them. It's key, though, to make sure that they're up to date, because as we've heard also, formulations, producers, trade names for these materials change over time. So your MSDS sheet should be from the manufacturer of your product, and it should be specific to the country that that product was produced in, or the country that it's used in, because exposure standards change depending on where you're located. All your lab staff must have access to these SDS files. If you've got them tucked away hidden in a drawer, they're no good to anybody. Let's go over some labels really quick that are common to especially chemical bottles that you may have recognized before. This is the National Fire Protection Association's Fire Diamond, and it's got a ton of really useful information on it, but it doesn't mean a thing if you don't know what those colors, those numbers, those letters mean. So if you use these on your bottles, they're nice, compact ways to label chemicals. Make sure that you also have a chart where your chemicals are stored to break down what all of these codifications mean. This you'll see on a lot of packaging and transportation materials. This is the DOT's hazardous material warning label, or an example thereof. There's a lot of different kinds. And they're quite accessible, and the icons are easy to understand, but they don't tell you anything about how to handle if something goes wrong with any one of these materials that happen to be labeled. This is OSHA's new hazard communication standard label. They started using this in 2012, and it is incredibly wordy. It is really hard to put this on a little bottle of cyanoacrylate, for example. But on the positive, it has all the information that you would need to know about that material right on the label, including first aid response, how to avoid injury or incident using these materials, what the manufacturer is, who to contact if there's a problem. That's really useful if you can stick this giant label on your chemical storage. Next competency is aptitude and prep tools and techniques. Some of these are really basic, so I'm just going to breeze right through and make sure that you're wearing the proper attire in the lab, that you have the appropriate PPE, and that you're using the appropriate equipment, especially when chemicals are concerned, for evacuating fumes, that your containers are labeled appropriately. This is pretty obvious stuff. I hope I'm not discussing anything new to anybody here. If you're using compressors and generators, you should be aware that there's dust concerns, there's fumes that they produce, particularly carbon monoxide, and that some of them require flammable fuels for their use. So especially if you're using these in the field, or if you're using them indoors for carbon monoxide concerns, they can have some restrictions that go along with them. There's three kind of categories of tools that we use in the lab and health and safety concerns that are unique to each. For power tools, just make sure that you can handle these big bulky casings that a lot of these tools have, especially if you need to hold them in a very particular position to accomplish a task. It can really hurt your wrists and your lower arms. And there's also a risk of injury from flying bits that come off of these. Damaged tools can result in broken blades and things like that, which can be very dangerous. When you're working with pneumatic tools, one of the main risks is hand-arm vibration syndrome, which results from the vibration that's produced from the tool. If anybody's used an air scribe for too long, you put it down and your fingers feel all tingly, that's nerve damage. And it builds up over time. If you don't give your body time to heal, it's cumulative and it can become permanent. So this is something that, fortunately, a lot of paleontology-specific research has been done on recently. And it's definitely something to pay attention to. You can kind of be aware of your own personal limits and get to know what your tools are uniquely doing to you. But there are some standards out there. The HSE over in England and the UK has some excellent standards about where you should be setting the cutoffs for your vibration limits and exposure, depending on what kind of tools you're using. There's also repetitive stress injury dangers that come along with using pneumatic tools, and the danger from respirable crystalline silica and the dust that is being produced by those tools. If you don't have a good air evacuation system for use with your air scribes, you shouldn't be using them. A fan just doesn't cut it. Being outdoors doesn't cut it. Wearing a respirator with a good particulate filter helps a lot. But crystalline silica and dust exposure is very different from something like a physical injury where you realize right away, oh, I pulled a muscle, I got to stop doing this thing. It builds up over time, and you may not realize that you've been overexposed to crystalline silica, and you've got permanent lung damage until many, many years after your initial exposure. So it's definitely something to keep in mind. Hand tool safety concerns, again, include repetitive stress injuries and puncture wounds. Nobody likes having, pin vices and things like that shoved through their hands, but it does happen, unfortunately. Finally, ergonomics, sort of whole body health and safety. Keep in mind that your workstation setups may not always be friendly to your body. You can kind of be holding yourself cramped in a particular position for a long period of time and can cause back and shoulder injuries as a result. So that's just something to be aware of, is your posture when you have these sort of long-term fixed positions staring into microscopes or working with small objects. Next competency is adhesives, molding, and casting. There are some concerns, definitely health and safety concerns when it comes to solvents, but they're also flammable. So you have to be concerned about both flammability and exposure hazards. Storage of solvents should be in flammable cabinetry, and that's separate from any acids or corrosive chemicals that you may also have in your lab. Dry powders should also be stored in sealed containers, mainly just to keep out dust, but there is also a dust explosion risk if enough of them should somehow get blown up into the air. When you're working with solvents, you should use a fume hood or a carbon filter dust extractor and be aware of where your vented air is going. We were very relieved to learn at the Smithsonian that our fume hoods were not venting out into the just adjacent play yard for our building's daycare center. When it comes to molding and casting, be aware that people can have allergic reactions to latex and resins, and these can be developed through exposure. So we do have latex gloves in our lab, but we also have nitrile gloves as well, and I prefer to use them just so I don't risk that developing an allergy. With casting, you get toxic fumes from resins and urethanes, as we've heard before, and you can also get fumes and particulate risks from sanding and grinding those casts in the finishing process. Next competency is archival labeling, housing, and storage. This is mostly a storage-based thing for me. you have to have clear, approved labeling for all specimen-based hazards. And depending on what your collections contain, whether or not they have wet specimens, whether you have, or not you have collections that are known for a radioactivity or a radon risk, that determines how your labeling kind of has to follow along with those hazards. You can have case-based sort of ways to control those hazards, which include cases that could vent radon or acid fumes. Make sure that if you have any old cases in your collections that they're tested for arsenic, pesticides, and lead in the paint. And if you have wet collections, you should install shelf bars across the front, so if you ever have an earthquake, your bottles won't shake off the front and then smash all over the floor. And then there are building-based health and safety concerns as well, such as mold from leaks and floods and high humidity, and naturally occurring radon that can be present in basements. There are ways that you can work around these problems when it comes to storage, and that's basically to house problem specimens together. You take all of your radioactive specimens, put them in a single radon sort of equipped case with good seals or ventilation, and that helps you to take care of your problem. You may have to argue with your collections managers a little bit because this may not jive with their storage organization scheme, but health and safety concerns should ultimately trump any storage sort of plan for your collections. Useful things to store with your collections include some PPE like nitrile gloves and respirators. At the Smithsonian, we actually have a portable emergency response kit in a wheeled garbage bin. That wherever a spill occurs or something's fallen off a shelf, they could wheel that garbage bin over, and it's got everything in it that we would need for spill containment. It's got all of our necessary PPE and instructions for emergency response. It's a very handy portable kit that we can just zoom anywhere that we need it, and almost anybody can use it. And preventative practices. This is, I think, a really important idea to consider in that you can minimize future handling needs and access needs for a specimen, especially if it's hazardous, by doing documentation at present. So when somebody pulls that specimen out for research purposes, say, hey, I just want to shoot a few extra pictures, I want to perform a few additional tests, have that data handy so you don't have to do it again in the future. Last but not least, understanding fieldwork. Fieldwork is a big thing because a lot of the health and safety concerns are quite separate from anything that we would encounter in the lab, but they're still really important because if things go wrong out in the field, more often than not, you can't call 911, you're off on your own. So be aware of any liability or medical coverage policies your institution has that's specific to fieldwork. If you're working with a team that comes from mixed institutions, those policies can differ, and it's important that you understand what those differences are. Plan ahead of time by being aware of any hazards that are specific to the region, Zika, things like that, any emergency contacts, and where the closest place to get medical aid is while you're out in the field. You should have PPE and equipment and accommodation concerns in mind while you're making your plans for your field work, and that includes making sure that everybody brings the appropriate PPE for them. That includes gloves, safety glasses, dust masks, and splash goggles also if you're going to be working with adhesives and consolidants in the field. Have a weather radio. It seems really simple, but not everybody brings them. Make sure that everybody has got their appropriate attire, a personal allotment of sunscreen, and a good way to carry a plentiful amount of water with them. Some people may have dietary restrictions, and that's important to know before you head out into the field. And some people may need to bring medication with them that needs to be kept cool, which can be very difficult depending on where you are. But there are ways that you can work around that and incorporate that into your field work as well. Also, delegating responsibility. What happens when you have teams that split up in the field? Do you only have one first aid kit, and now you have a whole team of people that has no access to first aid? What happens if you, as the field crew leader, you're the only one who knows what emergency number to contact, and a rock falls off the butte and hits your head, and you're knocked out cold? Nobody else knows how to call for help. So it's important to consider these things ahead of time. You can get into some pretty unique situations in the field. They do offer training courses just for wilderness first aid. I've taken one myself, and it was a lot of fun and involved a lot of fake blood. But it was really handy. It actually made me feel a lot more confident about situations that I could come into in the field, which I just wouldn't come across in the lab. That includes a field-specific first aid kit, which contains gear that you wouldn't have in your lab first aid kit, like specific splints, things like that. And things like a satellite phone, if you're not going to be within cell phone range to contact emergency medical personnel. There's also some behavioral implications in the field. Make sure that you can do safe lifting and carrying over terrain, that you're aware of off-road driving dangers, fire dangers, things like that. Exposure and dehydration, how to see that as it's happening. What's going to happen to your prep equipment in the elements? As Matt explained, there can be some dangers that are associated with heating equipment and heating bottled adhesives. And awareness, as Matt also said, of changing weather conditions, of your location, and the presence of any wildlife and domesticated animals. Everybody's got a good rattlesnake story in the field, so I'm just going to go just a tidbit over time to talk about mine. This lovely rattlesnake that we encountered at Petrified Forest just last summer. And it wasn't budging from the bush where it had lodged itself, and it was right at the edge of our field campsite. The sun was setting, and we didn't really want this guy hanging out around camp at night. We're in a national park, and I love snakes, so we're not going to kill the poor thing. And so it was decided that it would be pinned down with somebody's hiking stick, and we actually picked it up, put it in a spaghetti pot with a lid, and walked it about a mile out of camp, and then let him on his merry way. Those are not my hands. I like snakes, but I don't like rattlesnakes that much. So I'm going to leave it up to you to decide whether or not this was the best way to handle this situation. This is really, really dangerous, and I'm so happy that nobody got bitten. But I like snakes. Here's the full text of the competency. So I'll leave this as the last slide and just say thanks to all of my coworkers who have helped me ensure a safe working environment, and thank all you guys and the organizers for the conference for arranging this talk today. I hope it's really been helpful.